The destruction in Crimea was terrible. There is a long list of equipment, machines, tractors and combines that the Nazis either destroyed or took out. But there is no point in bringing it here. The destruction was terrible. That's all there is to say. Sevastopol lay in ruins. Out of 140,000 inhabitants, only 3 remained there. In February 1945, year after the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt and Churchill came there. As eyewitnesses recalled, Roosevelt said something like, "It will take 50 years to rebuild your city. And this is possible if we help you. You can't do without our help." The President of the United States, a man of great intelligence, without the slightest irony, turned out to be a bad prophet. Everything turned out contrary to his words. Churchill told Stalin, in his opinion, Sevastopol will not be restored, it is worth preserving its ruins as a historical memorial and building the city anew in a new place. Stalin replied firmly, Sevastopol will be revived as a Russian city. And so it happened. Back in 1944 year, Sevastopolstro was created. A special construction organization for the restoration of Sevastopol and the facilities of the main base of the Black Sea Fleet. The work continued for more than 1 year. Only in February of 1957 year, a report on the complete restoration of Sevastopol went to Moscow. However, 13 years. These are not the 50 voiced by Roosevelt. In parallel, other cities were restored, factories and shipyards were built, tractors, cattle, horses, sheep and goats were sent there. Migrants from Russia stayed en masse in the fairly depopulated Crimea. In a word, the whole country was restoring Crimea. As however Ukraine, where the Germans not only blew up the Dnieper dam and turbines, but also caused a lot of other destruction. The Black Sea Shipping Company, civil fleet, passenger and tourist vessels, whaling flotilla, fishing signers were formed at a rapid pace. You can write a separate book about how a strong industry appeared and agriculture and resorts developed. No wonder Crimea was called the All-Union Health Resort. February 25, 1954. A black day of Russian history. It was then that the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR appeared on the transfer of Crimea to the USSR. Another Khrushchev election. In general, dear Nikita Sergeyevich, that was the name of the lickspittle film about him, which I still found as a schoolboy. The figure is extremely muddy and unique in the scope of the harm that Khrushchev inflicted on the Soviet Union. There are also military reforms, when military equipment was cut en masse into milestones, and officers were dismissed by tens of thousands without any pension. Nikita vividly made the main bet on rocket technology and considered all other types of troops auxiliary. Here is the stupid idea of dividing the regional party committees into industrial and agricultural ones, which have brought a lot of chaos to the country's governance. The party members secretly joked among themselves, if things go on, there will be heads of goose, heads of sheep, heads, a cow. Here, the introduction of the Queen of Corn Fields almost by the Arctic Circle, and almost the defeat of state security, when many aces of foreign intelligence turned out to be on the street or even in prison as bereaved bone cruisers, who were in no way involved in the repression inside the party. With special pleasure, Khrushchev cleaned the organs of the Jews. And much more, up to the Caribbean crisis, which almost turned into a nuclear war, and the development of virgin lands, dealt a serious blow to the agriculture of the Russian non-Chernozem region. Repressions against the Orthodox Church, 10,000 political prisoners, execution of popular demonstrations. All of this looks, first of all, like an almost continuous chain of idiotic decisions of a not particularly strong-minded Secretary General. However, suspicions have been expressed for a long time that there is something unclean here, that it makes sense to talk not about stupidity and inability to conduct state affairs, but on the contrary, with smart, consistent, purposeful actions of the enemy, who was not exposed at the time to freedom, let everyone out. So, finished playing. On the one hand, Khrushchev, who had danced a lot with the Trotskyists in his youth, seemed to have seen the light, and sincerely departed from the Trotskyists. On the other hand, the accusations made against Stalin, both at the 20th Congress of the XVII and after, very often repeat Trotsky's pre-war attacks like two drops of water. The coincidences are almost textual, with an admixture of the creative heritage of Dr. Goebbels. Khrushchev's other actions against state security are a vivid example of the Serebryansky case, which I have already written about in detail in the book about Stalin. It is simply impossible to interpret otherwise than as revenge for the Trotskyist leaders who were put to the wall at the time. Perhaps it's not just about carefully hidden Trotskyist sympathies, but something even worse. But there is no exact proof. And it is unlikely that there will be any more. However, the main reason why Nikita gave Ukraine the Crimea, which did not belong to her, with a broad gesture, has been calculated accurately. In the struggle against his political opponents, the Politburo and the XVII Central Committee, Khrushchev, among others, later relied on numerous and influential party organizations of Ukraine in the XVII, which became one of Khrushchev's main striking forces in the fight against the so-called anti-party grouping of Molotov, Malenkov, Kaganovich, and Shipilev. In fact, these party leaders and their supporters were just trying to remove Khrushchev, not so much for the fact that he debunked the cult of Stalin's personality, but out of a clear understanding of the troubles that Khrushchev's rule brings to the country. The first secretary of the Crimean Regional Committee of the XVII, Titov, who spoke out in Moscow against the transfer of Crimea, was immediately removed from office and lost the deputy mandate of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Khrushchev's decision completely contradicted both the Constitution of the USSR and the laws of that time. According to Article 18 of the Constitution, the territories of the Union republics could not be changed without their consent, and the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR had no authority to change the borders of the republic. Like the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, according to Articles 14 and 31, it had no powers. However, Khrushchev, both then and later, somehow did not pay much attention to the laws and the Constitution. What is an example of when his personal will, in connection with the case of foreign currency traders, the death penalty was introduced into the criminal code for one number. This is an unprecedented thing in the world legal practice. So it happened with Crimea. The decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR on the transfer of Crimea from the USSR was approved by the Presidium of the Central Committee of the XVII, another absolutely illegal decision. As was already the case with the resolution of the Supreme Party Forum on the instruction of the Prosecutor General's office to conduct the trial of Beria and his accomplices. It happened on the 25th of February, 1954th year. And on the 5th of February, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR obediently decided to transfer the Crimean region to the Ukrainian USSR. However, for the vast majority of the inhabitants of the USSR, including the Crimeans themselves, it went somehow even unnoticed. If there was a single country, the Soviet Union, and no one was alarmed about this, then they could even see in a bad dream that a single country would scatter to national apartments. Dozens of industrial enterprises of the so-called Union subordination, that is, subordinated directly to Moscow and not to Kiev, continued to work quietly in Crimea. As for the main naval bases, they retained a special status altogether. Back in 1948 year, by decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, Sevastopol was withdrawn from the Crimean region, became a city of Republican subordination of the USSR. A special city with its own administrative and economic apparatus, its own budget, approved in Moscow. As for the second most important Soviet and naval base of Balaklava, it disappeared from geographical maps altogether, becoming a completely closed city where even residents of Sevastopol could not get without a special pass, and it was extremely difficult to get to Sevastopol itself. Residents with a local residence permit had to have passes with a border zone stamp, and visitors had to have special permits. In 1984 year, by the decree of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, the access regime for Sevastopol and Balaklava was further tightened, in which the Kiev authorities did not take any part. Everything was decided in Moscow. However, at one time, there was a legal incident. In April 1978 year, the USSR adopted a new constitution, according to which Sevastopol was now part of Ukraine as a city of republican subordination to the USSR. A week earlier, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR adopted a new constitution, where only Moscow and Leningrad were listed as cities of republican subordination. But, at the same time, the decree of 1948 of the year on the special status of Crimea as part of Ukraine was not cancelled. So, both supporters and opponents of the Crimea as part of the USSR could refer to one or another document, which in principle had the same legal force. However, there was no special Ukrainization of Crimea then. After all, then the song "My Address" was not a house or a street, my address was the Soviet Union. According to this song in general and life, it was believed that wherever a Soviet person went, he was always at home everywhere. The embers were singing even then, but it was coming deep. I can safely rely on personal impressions. In January-February 1991, I lived in Yalta for almost a month. And I didn't find any such traces of widespread Ukrainization. I have a good memory, but I completely forgot what language the clippings were in. But I remember perfectly well that the Russian speech was mostly heard everywhere. Everyone spoke Russian, sellers at the market, in shops, hairdressers, policemen, waiters. Only one of the radio channels broadcast in Ukrainian, and there were a small number of books in the same language on the bookstalls. It was there that I bought The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in Ukrainian, having received untold pleasure while reading. Don't get me wrong, when I read in Ukrainian the book of Ukrainian writers, the same Black Rada Kulesh, Pavlo Zagrabelny, Ostap Vishnu, Kondrat Netel, there was no laughter, but a world classic translated into Ukrainian, like the same Tom Sawyer, sounds a little humorous. That was the impression left. In the same place, by the way, I had to face the activities of the Crimean Tatar nationalists who had revived by that time. But this is purely from the field of jokes, which the sellers at the market told me about, laughing. A bazaar is a bazaar. Among the odds and ends, there were a lot of badges with a variety of symbols on the shelves. And with the Ukrainian trident, and with the tricolor Russian flag, or the imperial crowned eagle. So one day, a gloomy Crimean Tatar appeared at the bazaar, methodically moving along the counters and buying badges with any Russian symbols with experience. Bought up and left. He reappeared for tomorrow, clearly having no idea about some of the ABC true market. Demand, as we know, generates supply. There are even more icons on the shelves for tomorrow. And the hapless fighter with the Muscovites clearly did not have enough money to buy everything. Somehow imperceptibly disappeared. This is the Ukrainization. But a couple of lessons a week were devoted to the Ukrainian language, but even ethnic Ukrainians, and not only in Crimea, but also outside of it, preferred to send their children to Russian schools. After graduating from school and speaking only Ukrainian, you can't make a further career, somehow, in conditions when all scientific and technical documentation remains in Russian. Then it will change, but in Soviet times they didn't even think about it. Then, self-consciousness broke out. Independent Ukraine in some ways extremely resembled Austria-Hungary, rightly called the Patchwork Empire. True, Austria-Hungary was inhabited by very different peoples, with the collapse of the monarchy hurried to separate from Vienna. The situation in Ukraine was a little different. It simply turned out to be divided into several parts, even if they were not marked on any map. The language and culture were certainly different. Donbass and Kryvyi have never been part of historical Ukraine, as well as Kharkiv, which I have already written about. The whole trick here is that the Bolsheviks, having created the Donetsk-Kryvyi Rog Republic with its capital in Kharkiv, at the beginning of the Civil War, declared it Soviet Ukraine. From the point of view of tactics, the move was, admittedly, quite clever. Now the rest of Ukraine seemed to be just a kind of rebellious Soviet region of Ukraine, firm where it was necessary to kick out the hetman and petliura and numerous baits who often did not obey anyone. Which was in the end done. However, as already mentioned, Soviet Ukraine with incomprehensible generosity began to cut off huge chunks of territory. that had never been part of it. In the east and in Novorossiya, there were a considerable number of people who considered Russian as their native language. And on the left bank, including Kiev, the so-called Surzik was in great use. The local dialect with an admixture of Ukrainian words, which the Russians understood without difficulty, and communicated in it without the slightest strain. Galicia is more difficult. There, as already mentioned, almost its own language has developed. I am not an expert in this matter, and I do not undertake to express my opinions. But there are authors who generally consider Galicians to be a separate anthropological type and derive their ancestry from Moldovans, and those, in turn, descended from the ancient Dacians. And it must be emphasized that in western Ukraine, Volhynia has always stood a little apart from Galicia. There have developed their own historical conditions. There were much more Poles living in Volhynia than in Galicia, and the Volhynians somehow always got along with them better than the Galicians. Bandera and Volhynia had much less support from the population, but the movement of Taras Bulba Borovets gained momentum just in Volhynia. And finally, Transcarpathian Rus. The Russians inhabiting it consider themselves to be Russians, but not Russians, and certainly not Ukrainians. They have their own language. A lot of words are not similar to either Ukrainian, Polish, or Russian. Russians have always been extremely negative about attempts to Ukrainize them. But there are also Hutzels, Boyki, and Lemki. Again, Russians with their own languages. However, in the newborn state, they began to introduce forcible measures, like potatoes once, to introduce a language created on the basis of Galician. Surzik, a living spoken language, was officially persecuted, forbidding it to be spoken in schools and public institutions. Russian was forbidden to teach at universities in Ukraine in the early 90s, and some special zealous teachers forbade even students to speak Russian in the corridors and classrooms on purely everyday topics. I remember, in the year 2006, I went to my room in one of the Kiev hotels. The maid, already in years, talked to the doorman, also my age, in the purest Russian. Having adjusted the badge with tridents on my lapel, I approached them with a chiseled step, stared sternly and menacingly asked, "And the Hybans on Derzhavna and fashion?" They sat down like that. And they were silent until I left. Well, we had more fun then. And things gradually unfolded not funny at all. When replacing old passports with new ones with a trident, the names and surnames of completely Russian people were forcibly Ukrainized. Zhelezniak was now Zelizniak, Pushkar, Garmash Garmata, in Ukrainian, Canon. There have been sadder cases. Pensioners were given medicines en masse, where there was only one instruction for use on the sovereign's move, which the old men and women did not understand at all. Derzhavna move continued to write enthusiastically. Shirokrat writes about the Russian-Ukrainian medical dictionary with foreign words, published in Kiev back in 2002 years. Would you like some examples? Outpatient clinic. Prihidnyu. Ammonia. Current. Analeptics. Revivals, implantations. Pharmacy. Komoro. Shovish. The pharmacist. Likivnik. By the way, none of these new Azov words are in the same Polish language. I simply cannot understand other details of this process with my mind. Some words are taken directly from Polish, but other Polish ones are diligently looking for a replacement. Instead of an airport, there is now a Letelish. Well, now imagine for yourself, who outside of Ukraine will read scientific works written in this language. In what position will a university graduate who undertakes to communicate with foreign colleagues get into? There are few foreigners who can seriously break their heads over Letelishemi and Prohidnyu. I'm not going to digress from the topic, I'm just going to tell you how things were and are in other countries. Few people know that for the first few decades, Andersen's fairy tales were published both in Russia and in Europe, not in Danish but in German. The reason is simple. The Germans, the closest neighbors of the Danes, and they had a lot of experts in Danish, unlike many other European countries, where there were 1.5 specialists. We can recall how things are in India. There, at one time, the problem was solved not without grace, making English the official language of intraethnic communication, without bothering with the fact that it was a legacy of colonial times. There were purely practical reasons. If a scientific paper is written in Hindi, Urdu or Bengali, the languages of the largest nationalities, a lot of fellow scientists simply will not understand it. One can imagine how many translators would be needed from Hindi to Urdu, and vice versa, from Bengali to other. Well, in parallel, the ninth wave of amazing discoveries poured in with regard to the origin, history of the ancient Ukrainians, and their language brought from Venus. Grbachev case continued with an incredible scope and imagination. Under the slogan of Ukraine See Europe, it was officially announced that the ultimate goal of Euro-Atlantic integration is for Ukraine to gain full membership in the European Union and NATO. No more and no less. That's just the case somehow stubbornly did not dance. With the collapse of the Union, Ukraine received a powerful reserve with the economic use, capable of turning it into a prosperous and rich state. High-precision manufacturing, advanced science, powerful industry in ferrous metallurgy, aircraft and rocket engineering, the Black Sea Shipping Company, the shipyard in the long term, a serious flow of Russian orders, and finally, extensive Chernozems. Where most of this has gone, no one today is able to explain properly. Part of it is unknown where it is sold out, part does not work, part is frankly agonizing. The EU, not to mention NATO, is somehow in no hurry to accept. There are enough problems of their own to hang extremely dubious jewelry in the form of Ukraine around their necks. Little things like unauthorized fence, that is, the theft of Russian gas going to Western Europe, are even boring to remember. The paradox is that Ukraine, with all the rabid anti-Russian propaganda and even direct hostile actions, continues to beg loans from Russia today. Some sober-minded figures of the West have already realized who they have contacted, and they are not in a hurry to give money, reminding of old debts and actions. There were actions. According to current information, activists from Nonso fought on the side of militants in Chechnya. Spiritual heiresses of the Aun. This can still be attributed with great stretch to the excesses of singles. But during Georgia's invasion of South Ossetia, Ukraine not only supplied Georgia with anti-aircraft missile systems, but also sent its officers to manage them. Fortunately for themselves, these consultants managed to escape from the advancing Russian paratroopers in time, but their Ukrainian documents, obviously fearing to be captured with them, were scattered in the bushes, where General Shamanov's Blue Berets found them. Privatization of state property and shock therapy of prices, which has long been no secret, both in Russia and in Ukraine, were often carried out by the same persons, American advisors. The consequences are well known. The standard of living was falling, prices and taxes were climbing up, once flourishing enterprises were getting up, tensions between the West and the East of Ukraine were growing. Of course, all these troubles could not have spared the Crimea, how else? I have already written about the widespread Ukrainization. Crimea was not only a naval base, but also had many testing grounds for the most modern military equipment. The largest of them, Balaklava. The new Ukrainian government raked most of the landfills under itself, after which part of the ground equipment, including for testing supermodern submarines and even laser weapons, was partly evacuated, partly looted by unknown persons, destroyed and mothballed. You can guarantee that in the midst of this mess and chaos, something interesting has fallen into the hands of American intelligence. Only an idiot would fail to take advantage of such a situation, and fools in the US Special Services in general does not keep. The Black Sea Fleet was divided between Russia and Ukraine in the early 90s. 2/3 Russia, the rest Ukraine. After that, the new owners who raised yellow and blue flags not only forbade the Black Sea residents to conduct training missile launches, but also to conduct Marine Corps exercises, and at the same time, they sold about half of the hydrographic vessels that they inherited to various merchants, from boats to large ships capable of conducting research in the world's oceans. Independent Dershaven, presumably, oceanographic and hydrographic studies were not needed at all. Border patrol ships were also received. of the 17 reconnaissance ships that carried out electronic reconnaissance, 4 remained. At the end of 2005, at the beginning of the 2006 year, Ukraine, in violation of all and every agreement, began the so-called lighthouse war, trying to seize lighthouses when dividing the fleet inherited by Russia. It was possible to do this only with Yalta. On several others there were Russian Marines. Activists of the next Hurrah Patriotic Union tried to break through to them by force, but Russian Defense Minister Ivanov warned that the guards, as they should according to the charter, could use weapons. After that, the activists somehow dispersed. And it should be noted that in the patriotic frenzy, the self-helpers managed to harm themselves in another way. At one time, the Ukrainian government forced the abandonment of a compact naval base, and now Russian military facilities were scattered all over the Crimea in great numbers, which later turned out to be only good for Russia. And what about Russia? Russia, represented by its permanent leader working with documents, actually surrendered Crimea without using the levers of pressure, in cases when they could still be used. The Autonomous Republic of Crimea, created in 1992 as a result of the All-Crimean referendum as part of Ukraine, was not supported by Moscow in any way. In December 1995 year, Moscow Mayor Bushkov initiated a meeting of the Federation Council of Russia on the status of the city of Sevastopol. His report clearly stated, if our fleet leaves Crimea, it will automatically strengthen the military presence of other states in the Black Sea and weaken Russia's geopolitical interests. Whose fleet would settle in the Crimea in the event of the departure of the Black Sea fleet, I think there is no need to explain. One significant detail: a modern warship standing at the Crimean berths is able to reach Moscow with cruise missiles. The fingerless guarantor of the Constitution and the master of the spoon game in 1996 year signed a package of documents, according to which the Black Sea fleet remained in Sevastopol exclusively on lease, and there was not even any talk about any problems of the Crimeans. By the way, in such transactions, whatever they relate to, the landlord wins first of all, who can break the contract at any time, and offer the tenant to go home, as it happened en masse, let's say, with the English peasants of the 19th century. One far from perfect day, the owner of the land showed up and announced that the tenant, although sometimes his father and grandfather rented this land, could leave, going back wherever he wanted. In the summer of 1995, the Special Forces of the Naval Forces of Ukraine were seriously going to seize the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Of course, it is always worthwhile to stock up on a theoretical justification in advance. It was not long in coming. In the 2006 year, academician Kononenko, director of the Institute of Ukrainian Studies, the same one who found one of the Ukrainian clans in the epic Mahabharata, announced from a high scientific rostrum that Sevastopol was founded by a Ukrainian, and it was there that the Kiev, that is Ukrainian, Prince Askal, was baptized. And 2 years later, a monument to the founder of the city, Hetman Peter Sagaidakhnom, was opened in Sevastopol. Apparently, the ancient Ukrainians founded Sevastopol somehow wrong, and the hetman had to rebase it, so to speak. Indeed, the hetman, as already mentioned, in the 20s of the 17th century, swam a lot on the Black Sea, attacking Turkish ships. But the trouble is, Crimea was so firmly held by the Tatars and Turks at that time that they would never have allowed it to be wrong. Not that the city was founded on its own land, but perhaps with a barbecue on the shore of visitors. By that time, Odessa was declared founded by Ukrainian Cossacks. The very old days, when there were no Muscovites even close. And without hesitation, they began to build another pillar of Ukrainian statehood.